Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. Would ask everyone in-house to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. It is always appreciated. Of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion this morning is James Roberts. He is our Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth in our Center for Trade and Economics. His primary focus is on the production of Heritage's annual Index of Economic Freedom. He also studies economic and political issues in Latin America and Europe, as well as development assistance and nation building. Before joining us here, he served in the State Department for 25 years with tours of duties in U.S. embassies in Mexico, Portugal, France, Panama, and Haiti. He also helped coordinate several major U.S. assistance programs, including efforts to reform the Eastern European economies and to reconstruct Iraq. Before public service, he was a financial analyst at Ford Motor, and he also served in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Please join me in welcoming Jim Roberts. Jim.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for joining us this morning. The problem of corruption is as old as recorded history, all the way back to the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. Over the years since, individuals and nations have grappled with it. As G.K. Chesterton once observed, people do not differ much about what things they will call evils, but they differ enormously about what evils they will call excusable. With his usual eloquent precision, Teddy Roosevelt put his finger on one of the perennial sources of corruption, political power, when he observed of the U.S. Senate of his day that when they call the roll, the senators do not know whether to answer present or not guilty. Across the ideological spectrum, thoughtful analysts have recognized the destructive power of corruption and its ever-present threat to undermine society, democratic governance, and economic growth. But the solutions they propose solve the problem very widely. Transparency International is a global civil society NGO that makes a constructive contribution. Their Corruption Perceptions Index is one of the 10 indicators we use to calculate scores for 179 countries in the Index of Economic Freedom that Heritage produces each year with the Wall Street Journal. Some anti-corruption proposals, we believe, are simply unworkable, no matter how well-intentioned. That is the case we make. My colleagues, Brett Schaefer and Stephen Groves and I, made in a backgrounder we published last week about the proposed International Anti-Corruption Court. I hope that you could take a copy on your way in or out. Now today, we will focus on another significant and heartbreaking source of corruption, hidden everyday violence, especially in less developed countries. Our speaker this morning, Victor Boutros, is one of the heroes in the ongoing fight against too many incidents of rape, trafficking, and police brutality that are devastating the developing world and undermining anti-poverty efforts. Victor Boutros is a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice who investigates and tries police misconduct, hate crimes, and international human trafficking cases of national significance. He is also a member of the Justice Department's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit. And he has trained federal and local law enforcement professionals in the U.S. on investigating and prosecuting federal civil rights crimes, and has taught trial advocacy to lawyers from Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and Africa. Prior to joining the Department of Justice, Mr. Boutros spent time working on similar issues in the developing world in Ecuador, India, and South Africa. Victor is a graduate of Baylor University, of Harvard University, of Oxford University, and of the University of Chicago, where he was an editor of the University of Chicago Law Review. In February of this year, Oxford University Press published The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence, a book that Victor wrote with co-author Gary Haugen, of the founder and president of the International Justice Mission. And this book, The Locust Effect, has been a Washington Post bestseller, has been featured in the New York Times, The Economist, NPR, The Today Show, Forbes, the BBC, other media outlets, and today here at the Heritage Foundation. Victor, we're honored to have you here with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be with you this morning, and I want to express my thanks to Jim and to John and the rest of the Heritage team for all the work that went into convening us together and making this time together possible. This morning, I would like to openly and shamelessly recruit you into a movement to transform the way that the world talks about and responds to severe poverty in the world. A movement that exposes a fundamental gap in the way that we've been thinking about global poverty and decisively moves toward a new approach. Now, I admit that sounds a bit grandiose for an ordinary Tuesday morning in October in the Lehrman Auditorium, but the stakes are high. You may not realize it, but historically we stand at a dramatic inflection point in the war against global poverty. While some encouraging progress has been made in reducing some of the most severe forms of extreme poverty, the fight against global poverty is threatened with stalling out. The number of people, for example, living off less than 5 quarters a day has dropped from about 1 in 2 30 years ago to about 1 in 5 today. But the number of people in our world who live on less than $2 a day is about the same as it was 30 years ago. That's almost 2 billion people living in very tough poverty. So, why are these billions of people in the developing world struggling to make their way out of poverty? There are surely a host of complicated reasons, but one is emerging with crystal clarity among experts in this area, and that is the problem of violence. Most of us probably already have a picture of what it's like to be very poor in the developing world. Maybe visual images pop into your mind of some of the grave challenges confronted by the poor. The child with the distended stomach, the shanty house, dirty food or water. If you've spent time in the developing world, you know that it's not hard to see evidence of abiding problems of hunger or homelessness or illness. Poverty's grind. But what is harder to see, but is no less a part of the experience of being poor in the developing world, is poverty's terror. The way in which the global poor are daily threatened by violence. Now, I'm not talking this morning about catastrophic violence, mass atrocities, genocides, civil wars, and rebellions that erupt onto the front pages of the world's newspapers, as tragic and destructive as it is. Rather, this morning, I want us to pull back the curtain on an even larger problem of violence that almost never reaches the headlines. This is the hidden plague of our era that is quietly devastating the hope of the poor. The everyday reality of common lawless violence. The way in which the poor are relentlessly subjected or threatened with being enslaved, imprisoned, beaten, raped, or robbed. In the new book that we released with Oxford Press earlier this year, we call the devastating impact of everyday violence on the poor the Locust Effect. History is full of horrifying stories of poor farm families who are forced to watch helplessly as a swarm of locusts suddenly descends and in a matter of hours destroys years of effort trying to plow and plant their way out of poverty. Likewise, it seems that we are approaching a pivotal moment in history where if we do not decisively address the plague of everyday violence that swarms over the common poor in the developing world, the poorest will not be able to thrive or achieve their dreams, ever. This is the locust effect. But what does this everyday violence actually look like? The largest and most pervasive category of everyday violence against the poor is gender violence. That is sexual violence and domestic abuse of women and girls. This is the story of Lucila, who's just a very typical mom who lives in a small Andean town of Huánuco, Peru, which is this just utterly unremarkable place, except for the little-known fact that it had a rate of rape that seemed to exceed the numbers coming out of the war zones of the Congo. Lucila's mother was a victim of domestic violence. Lucila herself was driven out of her home by violence. And Lucila's 8-year-old daughter, Yuri, was raped and murdered and dumped onto the streets. The World Health Organization has found that the locusts of gender violence kill and disable more women and girls between the ages of 15 and 44 than malaria, cancer, traffic accidents, and war combined, with poor women receiving the overwhelming majority of the abuse. The plague seems to be particularly devastating in Africa, where we met Laura. Laura lives in a slum in Nairobi, and she's been sexually assaulted by 3 different men in her community by the age of 10. Just as the world is waking up to the amazing way that poverty rates can be reduced when girls are provided with education, studies are now showing that one of the chief reasons that girls don't go to school is because of violence. Violence in the home, violence in the school, violence on the way to school. The second massive category of everyday violence that keeps the poor in poverty is forced labor. In Bangalore, India's famous high-tech capital that first sparked Thomas Friedman's epiphany that the world is flat, you and I could sit with Mariama and a dozen former slaves as they described what it was like when the locusts of slavery descended and swept them into a brick factory compound where they endured sadistic beatings and were forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no pay. The Global Slavery Index, which was released just a year ago, last October, documented that there are now nearly 30 million slaves in the world. That is more slaves in the world today than ever before in human history. In an era of exploding growth in some sectors of the developing world, there is just a massive sector of humanity that is literally held in poverty by force through slavery. A third devastating category of everyday violence that threatens the poor every day is police abuse. This is the story of Caleb in Nairobi, who's just doing what I did about a month ago. He's walking his kindergartner to school in the morning when he's randomly picked up in an extortion sweep by the local police. They throw Caleb in the squad car and just leave the son watching his father go off in the squad car, abandoned on the street. Caleb does not have enough money to pay a satisfactory bribe, and so Caleb is tortured by the police, who are desperate to extract a confession in a robbery case that they're trying to solve. So they hold Caleb in jail for more than a year. Meanwhile, the locusts of abusive police descend on Caleb's home, and under the guise of doing a searching his house, they end up devouring all the money that Caleb and his wife have been saving for their older daughter's education. As a result, in a moment of crisis, the poor don't run to the police, they run from the police. In many parts of the developing world, the police don't just fail to protect the poor from violence, but they are themselves the most pervasive criminal presence in the lives of the poor. Imagine the absurdity of a public transportation system that actually took people farther away from where they were trying to go, or a public education system that actually made children less literate, or a public health system that made people sicker. Yet when the World Bank concluded its largest study ever on the experience of the global poor, it found that developing world police and justice systems actually, quote, make poor people more insecure, more fearful, and poorer. The fourth category of everyday violence that devastates the hope of the poor is the violent theft of their land. Experts have documented that the poor's most precious asset for climbing out of poverty is usually a little piece of land where they can build a shelter and they can grow some food. But on a chronic basis, millions of poor people are left destitute when bullies in their community show up and violently throw them off their land. One of the groups most vulnerable to this form of abuse are widows, who collectively support 500 million orphans in the world. One of these widows is Constance. She lives in Uganda, and like millions of other widows in Africa, Constance found herself and her children cast into desperate poverty simply because she was violently thrown off her land. You can see why we're calling this plague of violence in the developing world the locust effect. Because of the way violence has the power to devour so much of our efforts to assist the poor, and because of the way none of those traditional efforts can stop the swarming violence. The medical clinic, for example, is of no use to the slave who can't get out of the brick compound to go see a doctor. The new schoolhouse is of no use to the girl who can't walk to school without being raped or who gets picked up and trafficked into a brothel. The microloan for the new sewing machine is of no use to a family like Caleb's if the police can simply steal the proceeds from the new business. The new high-yield seeds and farm tools are of little use to the widow like Constance, who's now been thrown off her land. And moreover, none of the medical clinics or schools or microloans or farm tools can do anything to stop the violence. This is why we have to start talking differently about poverty and start doing something differently as well. While our traditional approaches to poverty can't stop the violence, there is a very fundamental service that can. It's something that you and I depend upon every day to keep us safe from violence, but something that the poor in the developing world have almost never seen. And that, quite simply, is law enforcement. All of the categories of massive everyday violence that we've been talking about are against the law in the countries where they take place. The problem is not that the poor don't get laws. The problem is they don't get what the rest of us get, which is law enforcement. In Bolivia, for example, if you sexually assault a child, you are literally more likely to die from slipping in the shower than ever being convicted of your crime. Likewise, in India, if you actually hold someone in slavery, you're more likely to be struck by lightning than ever sent to prison. In the book, we talk about the surprising reasons why public justice systems in the developing world have become so broken. But at root, the reason why violent people oppress the poor is because they can. Sometimes the poor are so disproportionately victimized by violence that we're tempted to think that poverty causes violence. But of course, it's the other way around. We could make a similar mistake if we looked at the way that 90% of malaria deaths in the world happen among the poor and concluded that poverty causes malaria. Of course, poverty doesn't cause malaria. Mosquitoes do. It's just that the poor people don't get something that the rest of us do get: protection from mosquitoes and the malaria parasite. Likewise, poverty doesn't cause violence. Violent people do. But poor people don't get something the rest of us do get: protection from violence through law enforcement. In fact, in North America, you and I are so used to breathing the invisible oxygen of protection that stems from law enforcement systems that are working around us that it's hard for us to even imagine what it's like for billions of poor people around the world who have no justice system to protect them. That is until a year ago, when the story of a young woman in Oregon gave us a glimpse of what it's like to live in a world that without law enforcement. The young woman who lived in rural Oregon had been hospitalized about 2 weeks earlier by a violent assault from this guy. And now she's home alone on a weekend night, and he's back. And she's alone, and he starts to rip his way into her house, tearing through her window to come into the house. He's yelling threats at her. He's screaming. She's terrified. So she does what we all do. She calls 911, where she suddenly learned that due to government budget cuts, police only worked on the weekdays. But this was a weekend. And so the helpless 911 operator tragically explained, quote, "It's unfortunate you guys don't have law enforcement out there." This is an excerpt of the actual 911 call that took place.
I don't have anybody to send out there. Okay. Obviously if he comes inside the residence and assaults you, can you ask him to go away, or do you know if he's intoxicated or anything?
I've already asked him. I've already told him I was calling you. He's spoken before, busted down my door, assaulted me. So...
Is there any way you can safely leave the residence?
No, I can't. Because he's blocking pretty much my only way out.
Well, the only thing I can do is give you some advice and call the sheriff's office tomorrow. Obviously, if he comes in and unfortunately has a weapon or is trying to cause you physical harm, that's a different story. The sheriff's office doesn't work up there. I don't have anybody to send.
Sadly, I have to tell you that this man did break his way into her home and tragically choked and beat and raped her. We have to confront this stark reality, that this is what happens when there is no law enforcement in your area. And this is the experience of the world's poorest. In fact, the UN tells us that this horrific nightmare represents a way of life for 4 billion people who, quote, live outside the protection of the law. This can seem like just another massive, mind-numbing statistic, but the truth is that if you're a poor person in the developing world, you don't need a 911 operator to tell you that there's no law enforcement in your area, because you already know that you're going to wake up every morning forced to navigate the threats to your daily life in functional lawlessness. What's becoming manifest is that after 50 years and $3 trillion of poverty alleviation efforts, we've skipped a step. We have failed to build a platform of basic law enforcement in poor communities that will allow the poorest to the benefit of holding on to the benefits of our aid. It's not that poverty alleviation efforts haven't worked at all. Clearly they have. But we seem to be reaching the limits of what can be achieved without confronting the most intimidating aspect of poverty, the plague of everyday violence. The question now, after this really depressing opening, is there any hope? Is there any hope that public justice systems in the developing world can actually begin to work to protect the poor from violence? If we're honest, I think we have to admit that there's a strong temptation to be cynical. I have it. Though the rallying cry can sound inspiring at times, the problem seems to be so big and so intractable that part of us believes that nothing is really going to change. Where can we find solid footholds that we can use to begin to climb out of the abyss of cynicism? All right, here's your pop quiz for this morning. You didn't know you were going to have a quiz. Listen to this description of a broken public justice system and see if you can guess which developing world city it describes. Corruption in this city's police force is endemic. Precinct captains borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars from criminals to purchase their appointments in bribe-rich districts. Studies have found that brutality is rampant and unchecked. And an investigative commission concluded that every interest, every occupation, almost every citizen is dominated by an all-controlling and overshadowing dread of the police. The city's magistrate courts are also known to be corrupt, inefficient, and ineffective. And experts observe that while the rich are typically able to buy their way through criminal justice system when arrested, the poor usually suffer injustice by it. Any guesses? Chicago? This description of brutality and corruption and dysfunction could apply to any number of developing world cities today. But it's actually a description of New York City about 100 years ago. This, then, is the first great point of hope, the hope of history. It turns out that reasonably functioning public justice systems don't just fall from heaven. In fact, just about every reasonably functioning justice system in the world was at one time brutal and corrupt. In our book, we describe the forgotten story of how justice systems all across the developed world were radically transformed to provide a level of safety for common people that was unimaginable just a century ago. Each of the stories is unique, but in almost every case you find about 4 primary players: brave activists and journalists who told the truth about the abuse, church, civic, or community leaders who led with moral authority, lawyers and pioneering police leaders who demanded better of their professions, and enlightened elites in the business community who underwrote the crusade for liberty and justice for all in their community. Reclaiming this history, then, reminds us that transforming broken public justice systems is possible. The second great point of hope is a series of demonstration projects that are beginning to prove that broken public justice systems in the developing world can be transformed. We're beginning to see profound glimpses of what is possible in the developing world today. For instance, over just the last decade and a half or so, International Justice Mission, using a collaborative casework model, has not only brought tangible rescue to more than 15,000 of the poorest victims of violent abuse, but Lucila, the woman from Huánuco, Peru, who we met at the beginning of this talk, is now a leader in her community in the fight against child sex crimes. And IJM's local partner in that area has seen more than 200 perpetrators brought to justice. Thousands of slaves from the forced labor compounds of India have found freedom and dignity because trained investigative teams were sent to find them and were able to bring rescue and operations with local authorities. Now some of the former slaves are actually leaders in their community, rescuing others, and even holding public office. Laura from Nairobi is now safe and in school, and all 3 of her assailants have been brought to justice. Constance and her children in Uganda are now healthy and well, and she's a leader in her community helping poor families stay healthy because a team of advocates swept in to defend her from the bullies. Beyond these individual examples of success, we have seen safety begin to come to whole communities. We've been able to see community coalitions emerge in the developing world that begin to transform local law enforcement systems so that they actually protect the poor from violence. So in Guatemala City, for example, convictions for sex crimes against children have increased by 1,000% from the time that the collaborative casework model began to be applied there. In India, we've started to see Indian officials respond to training efforts with unprecedented mass enforcement actions against bonded slavery on their own initiative. In Uganda, we've seen levels of widow land seizures visibly decrease as government officials started to enforce the law. And in the Philippines, the Gates Foundation provided a grant to try and address the problem of child sex trafficking. And this actually emerged because they were interested in solving HIV and addressing HIV. So they went to the hotbed of HIV in South Africa, where it was rampant, and they noticed that some of the interventions weren't working as powerfully as they otherwise might. They go to local epidemiologists. What's going on? Why is this not affecting? Why is this not having the impact that we anticipated? And the local epidemiologist said, well, one of the challenges that we're seeing is that the interventions that are in place are directed only toward one group of people, those who are making some kind of choice about their sexual interactions. But there's this whole other group of people, this whole other category of people who are actually not making voluntary choices about their sexual interactions. They're victims of rape. And the interventions that are in place have virtually no impact on this group. So if we really want to make a dent in the HIV epidemic, we have to do something about the rape. Well, how do we do that? I don't know. I'm an epidemiologist. I don't know how to do that. And so part of the challenge is, how do you find models that work, that begin to actually attack this problem? So Gates provided sort of a seed grant to say, can the collaborative case model be proven to work? So here's what we want to do. We want to set this up almost like a science experiment. So we're going to go to a brand new place that you've never been before, a big city in the Philippines, Cebu, second largest city in the Philippines. And we're going to have a third-party auditor come in and do a baseline of victimization of child sex trafficking victims in Cebu. So we figure out what is the level of victimization. Then you come in, you do your collaborative casework model intervention, and we want to see if in 4 years you can reduce victimization in this city by 20%. 20% reduction in the victimization of child sex trafficking victims. And then we're going to have another third-party auditor come in, do another victimization assessment, and see where we're at. So 4 years later, the third-party auditors came in, and they actually documented not a 20% reduction, but almost an 80% reduction in the number of child sex trafficking victims in the city of Cebu. It wasn't that there was this massive intervention that changed the landscape of poverty there. It wasn't there's this massive democratization movement that changed in Cebu. What really happened is that law enforcement began to enforce the law with respect to one category of crime in one particular geographic area, and the number of victims went down dramatically. As a generation stands at an inflection point in the historic struggle against poverty, we need to invest resources toward making sure that the global poor get the basic protections of law that they need to climb out of poverty. And shamelessly, we want to double down on recruiting you into this movement. We want you to help us sound the alarm and change the conversation about poverty. In every circle of influence that you touch among people who care about the world, in think tanks, on the Hill, in academia, in the media, corporate centers, and the arts, we want you to help wake up the world to the plague of everyday violence and prepare the world to take on the locust effect. In every conversation about global poverty, someone should be asking the question, what about the violence? What about the everyday violence? What are we doing about that? How is that impacting this problem? Last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. Shortly before his death, Dr. King expressed another dream that sums up just about everything we want to say about the need to address the locust effect. He said, "On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway." While this vision of justice was something that Dr. King could only dream about 50 years ago, it is now something that we are being invited to fight for in the patch of history that has been granted to us today. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Victor. It was a really wonderful presentation and very stimulating, thought-provoking. I'm sure we have a few questions. We have some time, so There's a microphone going around. If you could please identify yourself and state your question. Go ahead.
Hi, Jennifer Marshall here at Heritage. I wondered if you're telling us to look beyond the surface level manifestations of poverty and look deeper, and that's something we try to do in domestic work on welfare reform and so on. And I'm just intrigued as you deal with a wider global sphere than I look at. Do you find that instinct to look deeper? Do you find that instinct stronger elsewhere, or where is your message better received? Do you struggle more to get it across in the States or abroad, where people might be more acquainted with the facts on the ground?
The place thanks for your question, Jennifer. I think the place that it resonates most is with people who are actually on the ground in the developing world working on this. And it's typically because they're having trouble meeting the benchmarks that are set for them. So for instance, you have the Millennium Development Goals, this sort of blueprint for development that's setting these benchmarks that then eventually trickles down to certain people who actually get hired, and it's their job to go meet this benchmark. We have to meet this, we're gonna report, go do this. You're a public health worker on the ground, go get this done. And they start working at it, and they're working really hard, and they're really good at what they do, and then they come back and they say, we're in trouble. We cannot meet this benchmark. Well, why not? Well, at every stage, we keep getting undermined by violence. We have these health benchmarks, but then, the girl's not going to school because she's getting raped, or she's contracting a disease because she's getting raped. Until we start dealing with the violence, we're not going to be able to meet these benchmarks. And so I think the people with boots on the ground who are trying to actually help the poor, I think, are those who resonate with it most. But it's not something that will be on the tip of their tongue, because the violence, unlike many of the other problems in the developing world, is much more hidden. The shanty houses don't hide themselves. The distended stomachs don't hide themselves. But there are actually human agents who are actively working to keep from view the violence from your eyes. Even frequent travelers in the developing world, it's just not as visually apparent. Lots of other problems are visually overwhelming. They're coming at you constantly. But it's very rare that you actually see with your own eyes the violence as it takes place. And as I see in my own work in the United States for the Justice Department, there's also this sort of really tragic irony, which is the victim also participates in this effort for you not to see the violence, because it becomes this incredibly, for them, it feels very shameful, and they don't want anybody else to know about it. So you have two human agents now that are both conspiring unwittingly, in a sense, to prevent you from seeing the violence. So that's part of the reason why we thought this book is so important, because there is this just subterranean world of everyday violence that's largely hidden from view. And until we begin to see that, it's hard for us to appreciate the bottleneck that's choking out the efficacy of so many other good efforts that we're pouring in the developing world. Because in the absence of something to wedge open that bottleneck, there's no credible deterrent to keep the bullies from coming in and taking the goods or blocking access to the services that the development community is providing.
Lisa.
Hi, Lisa Curtis. I'm Senior Research Fellow on South Asia here at the Heritage Foundation, and I've read your excellent book. It was very good. And I wanted to pick up on one of the themes. So you talk about the importance of the collaborative casework and working with the local officials and getting the local community involved. But you also said that international assistance was very important in the effort. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about U.S. programs that may have been successful or not so successful, whether it be USAID or the Millennium Challenge Corporation and their involvement. And also, if you could touch on the international business community. You talked about the Gates Foundation, but are there other corporations that are motivated to bring some of these issues to light and to cooperate, say, if they have investments in these countries?
Yeah. So there's a couple of challenges on both those fronts. One challenge is starting with the first part of your question about what about the role of the international community. So this has to be this locally owned effort, and that's what we see in even the historical portion of the transformation story. So when we start looking at public justice systems in New York and Chicago and Seattle and LA and Paris and London and Tokyo, places in the developed world that are now have reasonably functioning justice systems that were utterly indistinguishable in their dysfunction from what we currently see in parts of the developing world today, those stories are all different. And as you read them, you say, oh yeah, I can see it. These are really different stories. They have some common themes, but there is this sort of local ownership that's really contextual and applies sort of a very practical solution to the very unique problems that are arising in that context. So there has to be this sort of locally owned, very contextual approach to addressing the specific problems in a specific community. And I think that's one of the benefits of this collaborative casework method is it's by its very nature contextual and granular and looking at the specific problems in the system, because the only way, or perhaps the best way, to figure out where the holes are in the hose is actually to push water all the way through it, right? There's no way until you actually do that, you're just guessing. And so part of the benefit of the collaborative casework method is you begin to push these cases all the way through the public justice pipeline. And even when there's failures, you can at least begin to see where the specific holes are in this pipeline, and that may be different than in a public justice pipeline in another place. So the role of the international community, I think one of the challenges there is that there's a sense, I think, that, well, we're already doing so much. Like there's all this rule of law money, we're throwing a lot of money at this problem, it must be just a really hard problem, and that's why we're not seeing a lot of progress. But when we started trying to disaggregate, we talk about this big bucket of rule of law funding, what we started to notice is when we try and disaggregate the money and figure out where exactly is this money going. And Tim back here is in the room. He was a tremendous help in the research in the book, and he helped with this part of the project as well. We began to discover that rule of law has become this sort of overflowing category that has such breadth that almost any category of intervention can fall within it. And so when you look at the large number, you say, well, that's a lot of money that we're throwing at the problem. But when you begin to try and isolate where are the dollars actually flowing to, and how many of those dollars are actually going towards specific things that are designed to make the public justice system work to protect the poor from everyday violence, we couldn't find 1%. And so that's discouraging and encouraging in a sense, right? It's discouraging in that, well, we're not really devoting a lot of resources to this, but it's encouraging in the sense that it's not like, to borrow from Chesterton, this has been tried and found impossible. It's that it's been found difficult and left untried. And so part of the effort then is to say, well, we actually need to, as we did with the HIV epidemic, we need to actually start doing some incubation projects. Let's see what works. There are different models out there. There isn't a silver bullet solution, but that doesn't mean we don't make progress. We make progress by starting to see different incubation projects and then scaling up the ones that really work well. And we're still on the front end of that process where we're trying to incubate projects. We'd like to see more and more of the resources out there devoted to building the incubation projects that are devoted to actually, as Gates did in this case, really testing models to see what's effective and what isn't, and then scaling the models that work. The second part of your question related to the business community. And there's a challenge in the business community because the business community wants to benefit from some of the great things that are happening in developing world economies, and yet they also know that there are tremendous risks associated with operating there because public justice systems are broken. In fact, they, like the poor, know that the public justice systems are so broken that they won't work. And so what they've done is they've essentially abandoned the public system altogether and created these private workarounds. So instead of going to clogged and corrupt courts with their legal matters, they go to alternative dispute resolution. Instead of relying on corrupt or untrained police officers for their security, they go to private security. And private security is now this booming operation. The largest employer in Africa is private security. There are 4 times as many private security personnel in India in India than there are actual public justice officers. In Guatemala, the number is 7-1. The ratio is 7-1. So there's this incredible move by those with means to essentially opt out of the broken public justice system and create a new working private substitute system that will accomplish the goals that will help them to benefit economically. And so as a result, you've seen these situations where you'll have GDP growing up. So it looks like, hey, this economy is really improving. GDP is going up, but it's so stratified. Poverty reduction efforts are actually slowing as the GDP is going up. So you have this real stratification where those who have access to the working private alternatives begin to enjoy the fruit of that benefit, but the poor who simply can't afford it are stuck descending and dropping further and further and more deeply into poverty. So part of the challenge is getting the business community to buy into building a public system. It's just like any other public system, right? It's like when you have a public school system, when the people of wealth and means and abandon that system, or a public transportation system, what happens to the system? It slowly begins to deteriorate. But what it's really scary is what happens when that system's not the public library or the public school, but it's actually the core system of basic public safety. And that's where the poor are at today.
Too bad Thomas Piketty didn't read your book before he wrote his. Another questions? Terry.
Terry Miller from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for your presentation. You describe a couple of situations, one where there's just an absence of rule of law. People don't have access to anything. And then on the other flip side of that is where they have access, but the system itself is corrupt and may in fact be the oppressor. And it's very hard, and you also seem to imply in a critical fashion that these private security systems growing up in India and elsewhere, somehow that's a problem. We actually like private markets here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm not sure that isn't a viable solution in some cases, and I'm also not sure there's not another solution out there, which is to directly empower the people who are do not have access to adequate public justice systems that perfectly consistent with our own traditions here in the United States. Have you considered actually arming some of these people? You gave us a very evocative description of this poor woman in Oregon who was apparently in a remote location, didn't have weekend service by the sheriff's department. I'm not sure if she'd had weekend service by the sheriff's department if they would have arrived in time to do anything other than take her report or perhaps take care of her body. But I am absolutely certain that if she had had a gun, she would have been able to, or at least had a chance to deter the person who was attacking her.
Great questions. Let me start with the point about the private substitutes. So I'm not being critical of the multinational corporations for using these private substitutes. That is an absolutely perfectly appropriate and rational thing to do, right? It's not, the public system isn't working. If you're going to operate and you're going to have your employees there and their families, you got to have private security. So it's nothing, it's perfectly rational and understandable, and it makes sense. It just emphasizes the fact that the poor who can't afford that, they continue to have no viable system. So it's not that the private substitute is illogical or bad. It's a very logical thing. But what we also want, as we have in the United States to some degree, is you can have sort of private security, but you also want to have at least a baseline of basic public safety that everyone has access to regardless of the resources that they have. As to sort of the question of at the very beginning of your question, you said there appears to be a distinction sometimes between people having no access to justice or having access to or having sort of corrupt police officers in a corrupt system that's working for them. Those are constantly interchangeable in these places. And what we're really talking about here are not sort of the failed state scenarios, but really relatively stable developing world countries whose public justice systems, nevertheless, are very broken. And what you see in these countries is it's a bit like if we all sort of stepped out of our suits and put on scrubs and masks and walked into a hospital, and all of a sudden it was our job to manage surgeries that were coming through. we would look like surgeons. We'd have the tools of surgery. We'd have a scalpel. But if you actually started letting me do surgery on people, I'm going to cause more harm than good because I don't know what to do with this scalpel. And that is the case in 85% of the constables in South Asian police have virtually no training. They're given the uniform, they're given their scalpel, their sort of tools of the trade, and even then they often don't even get their full set of tools of the trade, and they're told to go do law enforcement and criminal investigations without almost any training on how to do it. And so there's this weird scenario where it looks like there's police. There's people with black robes and judges. There's prosecutors. It looks like there's police officers, but they essentially are not doing their function. Just like it would look like there were surgeons, but really we're just kind of dressing up like surgeons. We're not really surgeons. And so that interplay creates these perverse incentives for police officers. So if you don't know how to do your job, if you just haven't been taught to do your job, but you're measured on certain metrics that you don't know how to achieve, how do I solve this crime, then you go to sort of the laziest form of law enforcement, which is often torture, or discouraging people from reporting a crime in the first place because you want to keep the crime rate down. And so you're going to resort to these other tools in part just because you don't know how to do, you haven't been taught how to do the basic criminal investigations that you need to do. So sometimes it looks like an absence of a functioning police. Police are just sort of ignoring you and brushing you away and telling you to get over it. Other times it's actually more malignant, and they're actively causing you problems. The last question was about what about arming them? Is that a possibility? Is that something that's been looked into? And actually, that's been part of the challenge that's driven. There's a relic of that has driven part of the challenges in international funding, which is in the 1960s and 70s, the Office of Public Safety, which was loosely affiliated with the CIA and doing some intelligence work, began to give money in sort of the spirit of development to police agencies to begin to do training and criminal investigation. And what ended up happening is some of those tools started getting co-opted into torture and other sort of embarrassing episodes that came out. And Congress sort of swung the pendulum to the other side. And in 1974, I believe, they passed an amendment to that law that basically said, that's it, no more. No more money goes to public justice systems. We can't do that anymore. It's too risky. We'll carve out a limited exception for narcotics trafficking because we really care about that. We don't want that spillover crime to have a larger impact. But basically, we're really limiting this out. And it's been this sort of slow trickle effect where there have been additional exceptions that have trickled in over time. And just recently, in 2005, there was a broader amendment that allowed for more investment in building public justice systems abroad. But part of the relic of that created this fear of, well, what if are we going to just be essentially doing these political operations where we're arming mini militias that may end up doing more harm than good? And so the arming piece there's been sort of a patchwork of history on that score that we're still sort of working out the balance from. Yeah.
This might go more to the historical section of your research. Do you find that it's as a justice system develops, is it more easy to tackle organized or disorganized crime? So organized would be, a slave ring, a drug gang, et cetera, versus the disorganized of just, drunk guy rapes girl in the street.
Yeah. So I think what the underlying premise of your question, I think, is that there is this triage element. Like there is we have a limited amount of resources. Where can we get the most bang for our buck? Is it going after sort of petty crime or organized crime? Organized crime syndicates that maybe have broader impact but are not necessarily afraid of law enforcement or willing to sort of openly flout law enforcement. And what we have found is that in most parts of the developing world that we have operated in, the vast majority of crime is not terribly organized. It is mostly sort of petty crime, and most of this violence is not due to the overwhelming power of the oppressors. It's not that the criminal syndicates are overwhelmingly powerful. It's rather that the victims are so overwhelmingly vulnerable. And that's why I think you can see something like what happened in Cebu, where a pretty modest investment in making law enforcement work to enforce a crime can have this tremendous drop-off effect, this 80% drop. Because really, these are, in the developing world, most of these crimes are crimes of opportunity. And if you sort of look at the graphs that compare sort of the sensitivity to risk of different types of crime, crimes of necessity, crimes of sociopathology, those are much less sensitive to deterrence, to risk. But at the moment, these crimes of opportunity are at almost a zero risk point. Like, right, remember those slides about in India, you can enslave someone, you're more likely to get struck by lightning or, fall in the bathtub. That's effectively zero risk, right? There's effectively zero risk. So there's almost no cost from the point of view of the criminal in moving forward with a crime of opportunity. And so there is, in a sense, this sort of low-hanging fruit of if we got limited resources, we want to, I think, be careful about what we've done so far, which is we devote maybe 80 to 85% of our resources to failed states or conflict states where it's the hardest possible circumstance to make it work. Or, do we focus on organized crime when there's a sort of massive category of petty crime of crimes of opportunity where a fairly simple intervention can have this dramatic impact? So I think in the collaborative casework models that we've seen work effectively, it's frequently less organized or loosely affiliated, perhaps, at the largest end of spectrum. But you can have this incredible deterrent impact from a relatively small number of cases.
Looks like we're out of time. These are really important issues you've raised, and some of the solutions you've proposed, I think, are inspiring. I'm sure many of us will be incorporating these ideas in our analytical models going forward. And thank you so much for coming. We hope you can come back someday. And please join me in thanking Victor.